I'm Rebecca Spang. I'm the deathly ill acting director of European Studies. I don't normally sound quite so croaky. And I'm going to try to keep sneezing and coughing to a minimum. It's wonderful to see so many people here. I think that says something about the vitality and importance of this topic. I'm grateful to Frank Hess for organizing it. We've got 4 presenters who will, I hope, speak briefly. And
we're going to exploit your cold. We'll ramble on.
Right, and I'm just going to sit over here in the
You can
cold
throw
for
the
heaven's
orange,
sakes.
throw the orange out.
Right, I'm going to eat something that has vitamin C. Sorry. So I'm just going to sit over here and hope I'm not contagious anymore. Thank you for coming. Thank you for organizing this. Frank, Olga, Ben, and Edgar, take it away.
All right. The inspiration for this actually goes to Olga Kalinzidou, whose idea initially was to do this, and from there, we talked to Rebecca and put together the panel, inviting Ben and Edgar to give us some different perspectives on Greece, the political left, and the future of the European Union. Since I have a number of my undergraduates in here who may not have a perfect background on the recent developments in Europe and in Greece in particular, I thought I'd start with a little bit of a general introduction, and then from there we'll go to Olga, to Ben, to Edgar, and then back to me to each give our perspective on the political left and the future of the European Union. So anyway, the Greek debt crisis, which started in 2010, has shaken the foundations of the European Union and dramatically altered the political landscape of Greece and other countries in the European South, most notably Italy and Spain. Greece has seen, among other things, the rise of a right-wing neo-fascist party, Golden Dawn, and the near demolition of PASOK, the Pan-Hellenic Socialist Movement, which was the party that dominated Greek politics from 1981 through 2004, and was in power again in 2010 under the leadership of Yorgos Papandreou. And they were in power when the crisis struck. The 2012 parliamentary elections, PASOK's support slipped to 12.28%, and by 2015 it was down to 4.68%. It's a minor party now in the Greek political landscape. Papandreou, the son of the founder of the party, Andreas Papandreou, formed a new party in 2015. He did even worse, 2.48% of the vote. The demise of PASOK, however, has not meant the demise of the political left in Greece. Like a phoenix rising from the ashes, it's a tired metaphor, but use it anyway. A newer leftist party, Syriza, an acronym that stands for the Coalition of the Radical Left, garnered 16.8% of the vote in the May 2012 elections. And then when that election failed to form a government, managed to get 26.9% of the vote in June of 2012. And 2.5 years later, in 2015, they found themselves in power with 36.3% of the vote and almost managing to gain an outright parliamentary majority. As it stands, however, they were 2 seats short, and they have formed a coalition with the center-right anti-austerity party, ANEL, or the Independent Greeks. Syriza, like ANEL, is an anti-austerity party. It opposes the legal and administrative changes that the previous government, which was center and center-right, agreed to in order to secure bailout funds. And the bailout funds are not insubstantial. They're 240 billion euros. It's a lot of money. Now, almost none of that has seen its way to the average Greek person. It's mostly been going to bail out banks and to service the existing state debt. Greece, as Olga Kalinzidou will point out, has surrendered its political autonomy to its lenders, who have been demanding legislative changes in return for continued funding. These changes, which are supposed to right Greece's fiscal ship, have included increased taxes, salary and pension cuts, the weakening of labor protections, deregulation, and the privatization of public utilities and other publicly owned companies. They have resulted in tremendous economic contraction, nearly 5% per year for the last 5 years, which was in line with what the U.S. experienced during the Great Depression. And Syriza was elected on a platform that pledged to provide relief to the hardest hit of Greek society and to renegotiate the terms of the bailout. Syriza's election and its attempts to renegotiate the terms of the bailout have shaken up the political status quo of the European Union. This panel will explore the challenges the political left faces as it attempts to govern Greece and to negotiate an easing of austerity with its creditors. It will also explore the repercussions of the Greek elections on the political left in other countries, Spain and Germany most notably. Do the Greek elections represent a broader shift in the politics of the European Union? What is the future of left-wing governance in Europe, and how might a rise of the political left transform the institutional framework of the EU? How do the European Union and its currency have a future? Do they have a future, I should say? Or are they destined to go down in history as one of the greatest failed experiments in mankind, in the history of mankind? And with that, I'm going to pass the baton to Olga Kalinzidou, who is the Associate Director of International Studies and the full-time faculty as well in its major program. She's a graduate of Indiana University and a very diverse scholar who focuses on everything from archaeology to immigration and curriculum innovation.
And food.
And food.
Important. Thank you, Frank. Well, I have to start this by a disclaimer that for the last 5 years I have been trying to understand how the so-called, and I will explain why I call it the so-called radical left, is actually framing the debate about Greece's entry and Greece's position in the EU. And I'll start by saying that throughout my adult life in Greece, I have not been part of the left. I have been part of the central right to a degree that, and I have been renegotiating this relationship. I was not politically involved, but ideologically I think I fall in between the central right and the lukewarm left, let's put it like that. So having said that, and having to situate myself in the historical significance of the rise of the left in Greece, I want to go to a particularly important event today in Greek society, which is Greek independence Day. So when Frank told me that the day of our panel would be March 25th, I said, oh, that's symbolic, because now I can really, now I can really start thinking about the ideological ramifications of what the left is trying to do and what it has accomplished and what is yet to come. So a little bit about the Greek, not War of Independence, but is not part of our discussion, but what does the celebration mean? It has double significance for Greeks. It is the ethnic celebration, meaning we got out of the Ottoman Empire and we actually, as a nation, proclaimed ourselves independent and sovereign based on the principles of the Enlightenment of self-determination and equal rights for the citizens, and society built upon the citizens and from the citizens. But it also has a very important religious connotation, and it is tied very much with the Annunciation of Mary. It almost always falls in the middle of Lent, and right now we're going through our Greek Lent, or the Great Lent, because it's sometimes about 50 days. But symbolically, as it was taught to us, it signifies resurrection. So a lot of the rhetoric that is going on around newspapers and social media in this state today is about resurrecting ourselves from the yoke of the EU, and how are we trying to do that through what Syriza is doing. The other thing that was important for me to understand this day, as the radical left has risen in power, I was expecting a different celebration than the ones that I was used to through my childhood for Greek Independence Day. Greek Independence Day has a lot of parades, the schools parade, every one of us is raising the flag. It's the only time that we raise the flag in Greece. We are not a flag-loving people, per se. We have military parades, and those have been curtailed before Syriza because of the added cost of the austerity. I mean, it was very much a part and parcel of the Papandreou regime not to have military parades and of the socialist ideology. Well, because of what Frank talked about, because of the cohabitation of the independent Greeks and Syriza, what we saw was not only a curtailing of these parades, but also a more heightened parade feeling, with Chinook airplanes just dotting the sky in Athens and tanks being on the streets parading, which is a huge cost in austerity. So I'll leave that symbolism for you to figure out later. And of course, what I didn't expect from Syriza also was to accept the Archbishop of Greece being there on the parade. Again, this is a religious and military ceremony under Syriza. So again, I leave that up to you to decipher about the radicalness of the left. So now I want to take my thoughts a little bit further and talk a little bit about how Independence Day was marked by the Minister of Education, Baltas, in Greece. To his very unusual letter to the elementary education teachers and students, he said, let's envision and reflect on this day as being the product of enlightenment and seek to implement equal rights for all Greek citizens. This has a big departure from previous programmatic announcements by the Ministry of Culture, especially to students. And I've got to explain that in the Q&A. So the interpretation of the Greek constitution basically as belonging to citizens and leaving out the religious aspect, it is not new. It certainly belongs and it's firmly situated in the left ideology. But to many Greeks, it leaves them wonder about how they are going to attempt to solve all these problems by going back to the Constitution and by giving them very conflicting messages, ideological messages. For the last part of my points, and these are just talking points, I'm going to turn to the humanitarian crisis in Greece. And the humanitarian crisis in Greece has been going on and raging in the last 5 years. I did research a couple of summers ago in the area bordering Turkey, and my research was about the immigration centers, as they're called now, hospitality centers. There is nothing but. They have been renamed. They're the hospitality/immigration detention centers that accept and take care of immigrants. That is one aspect of the humanitarian crisis that has been exacerbated by the current political situation in Greece. The other parts of the humanitarian crisis have been situated in the lack of healthcare services, the lack of welfare services, and the cutting of pensions by almost 50% in some groups of people. And I'm not exaggerating, and I can bring in examples in the Q&A of these things. And also, one more thing, the declining of the consumer power of Greek households. Basically, you're going back to necessities and you cannot even cover those necessities. And those have reverberations to other aspects of society, one of them being, migration of young people outside Greek borders. So Syriza's paradox is quite evident. They are trying to make the humanitarian crisis a #1 priority. In fact, as I was preparing my talking points yesterday, I just learned that the first law of the left government has been put into effect about the humanitarian crisis, and it delineates certain articles to giving relief to vulnerable populations, from providing meal points or vouchers to qualified households, to providing free electricity to about 300,000 households, especially vulnerable, and to giving rent allowance up to 700 euros to those who couldn't pay. And it is important that it has been signed into a law because now it can be implemented, especially with regards to the tax, the property tax, which many Greeks cannot pay. On the other side, Syriza has started to raid public health coffers as of yesterday to pay pensioners. So on one side, you're talking about relieving the humanitarian crisis. On the other hand, you don't have money to pay for the humanitarian crisis because the EU has not released any liquid assets to Greece. So this is a conundrum that Syriza finds itself. And I am going to stop by saying that as a person who is still grappling with the idea of how radical is a radical left in Greece, I want to say that ordinary Greeks, what I've been hearing from ordinary Greeks, I'm an anthropologist, I ask ordinary people, is two things. We have nothing to lose. We have hit rock bottom. So anything that comes our way has no consequence to how we're going to feel. And we need to get out of the euro and mind our own affairs. So I'm going to leave it there. I'm not a Cassandra. I hope not. And I want to hear what Ben and Edgar have to say.
Let me introduce Ben real quickly. Ben Robinson is an associate professor of Germanic Studies. He is a specialist in 20th and 21st century arts and culture of Germany, and has written, among other things, on Germany's socialist modernity. One minor clarification, the 240 billion euros that I mentioned, it comes in installments. It's not a lump sum. Mm-hmm. And it's always conditional installments. Greece has to do something in order to get money.
Yes, well, thank you, Rebecca, for coming out with the cold, and thank you, Frank and Olga, and for putting this together, and so many people for turning out. So I'm really happy. As Frank indicated, my area is Germany, and my focus is in all sorts of ways on socialism. So I was trying to think, well, what can I do here? I'm not a Greek expert. I can say, though, I'm a deep, my perspective is that I'm deep. I mean, it made me, you know, in the fundamental fibers of my being, happy that Syriza won its election victory. So in some sense, I'm coming at it. I don't want to give you a stump speech, though, on behalf of Syriza or my own, more in my area of specialty, the Linkspartei in Germany, the left party. But I figured what I could do that would be useful, and maybe, I mean, your setup of the on-the-ground situation and the contradictions of it in Greece is very, I think is very, felt very acutely on the level of left strategy, the way left parties think about this. So that's what I thought, where I thought I could be useful, just saying, let's look at the Syriza events and let's put it into a larger left narrative. And so I had mentioned to Frank and Olga that maybe I would deal with the Linkspartei, the left party in Germany. And, you know, I went, and as I was putting on my notes, putting down my notes, I went on too long, is that. So I think I'm actually going to cut that. And what I'm going to do is just respond, try and put it into a larger narrative, but really trying to help us think about what is the left meant to do, especially a left that calls itself radical. Mm-hmm. I mean, because I think we can pose that question, is Syriza really radical? And our mind boggles at it. What can a left do today? So I just want to say what the problem that's confronting the left today is, and then go through actually a recent article in The Guardian by Varoufakis. He's the finance minister of Greece, and the title of it was "Why I Am an Erratic Marxist," and just sort of go through his account there and take his various points and expand them into a larger scene that's facing the European left. And in fact, I want to expand it from Europe to Africa, to Latin America, and to the United States, including even an episode from my hometown in Cleveland with Bill de Blasio. And I want to do this in 4 or 5 minutes. So let me get to start and just say this very quickly, that Varoufakis and Tsipras both have this fundamental thought that one of the tasks of Syriza is actually to save capitalism. And strategically, they want to think, how can we save capitalism and yet preserve the popular rage and indignation against it? And as Olga has already indicated, that's an incredibly difficult and also dangerous strategy. They do have a coalition with Independent Greece, with a right-wing party. Rage can take on all sorts of political inchoate forms. What do you do when you want to both save capitalism and preserve a certain amount of rage or against it, or indignation, to allude to the Spanish situation? And so that's one strategic problem that they're facing. Now, why that's so hard, let me do the first part of what I said I would do, explain why it's so hard. For Varoufakis, for the finance minister, but I think for a lot of us who remember this, a traumatic moment was Reagan destroying the PATCO, the air traffic controller unions, and Thatcher in England. And Varoufakis, the finance minister, went to get his higher education in 1978, right as Thatcher was destroying the left and the labor movement and instituting maybe the proverbial modern austerity policy in England. And his insight was, which he later thought was false, was that this will provoke a reaction of the left. This is good. We can deal with this, and if we mobilize rage, that's enough, and we'll have a victory. That didn't happen. That didn't happen. So what matured in Varoufakis' thought was this, that the forces of austerity, if we call them, Christine Lagarde or Draghi or the people in charge of the Troika, these European leaders, they're generally from the center-right. And if we look at the problem that they're facing is how can we have a politics contrary to that, he realized that the weapon they have, the weapon the left will have to be able to confront is that they can use recession. They can use economic tools. They can use capital strikes, denying liquidity, access to liquidity, whenever they want. And that financial pressure point is devastating, and the left will lose over and over again in that battle. And that was his insight, and the rage is not enough to take us beyond that. And he actually cites the case of the platinum miners. No, he cites the case of the ANC, but I thought in particular of the recent platinum miners strike in South Africa, where the strike for wages, for workers' rights, had to be a strike against the ANC. And his formula is the ANC took on political power by agreeing to give up more or less in a practical way its economic demands. It ceased being a leftist party in the terms of a left economic strategy and a party of class struggle. And one thing that happened then was this recent ANC debacle where the ANC-supported unions didn't support the platinum miners and the radical unions did, and the government shot down the miners. There's also the situation in Venezuela and Ecuador and Latin America. There are very close ties with the European left, with Rafael Correa in Ecuador especially. They have an anti-austerity movement based there. And in a way, the pink tide in Latin America has had the greatest success for the left. So that's a very powerful model. But still, you look at what's going on in Argentina and Brazil, you look at what's going on, and you can see capital has all this power. More locally, if you look at Mayor de Blasio in New York, you can see his reforms. This is the center of global banking, but in all sorts of levels, and not only Republican Democrat, Cuomo in Albany is willing to impose strict financial conditions on New York for preschool or whatever in order to stop, I think, a leftist strategy there. So on every level, political level, they're squeezed. But also I want to mention one more factor, because this is very important for Syriza, and that is Moody's and Standard & Poor. Do people know what Moody's and Standard & Poor are? They're U.S. financial firms founded in the beginning of the 20th century that can give credit ratings. They do it. They're private firms. They can downgrade Greece's bonds to junk status. And boom, you have a sovereign debt crisis. Now, I'm not saying there aren't statistics and reasons that this is based on, but the power of Moody's and Standard & Poor and Fitch's is enormous. They destroy cities. So when I was a child growing up in Cleveland, the mayor of Cleveland, Dennis Kucinich, wanted to preserve our electrical power, Muni Light, because against rate hikes in electricity, which is very close, and Cleveland has huge levels of poverty. I wonder about its impoverished sector. It's probably very close to Greece's. And the mayor wanted to preserve this. All the board members, the interlocking boards of the Cleveland Electric Aluminum Company, Cleveland Trust, all these boards unified in a united front to deny loans to Cleveland and force it into default. And Moody's, Standard & Poor, bam, they downgraded the bonds. Cleveland, Mayor Kucinich was destroyed. Luckily, he went on to become a great congressional leader who was then thrown out, not by a rival conservative, another left candidate, but because the Republicans redistricted his district away. In any case, though, these are the problems that he's facing with. And then in short, as short as I possibly can, what are his answers? One of the things he says is, again, we cannot destroy capitalism. We actually have to save it and on the basis of transforming it, look for future strategies beyond it. But the short-term goal is to save a fairer capitalism. And that, he says, has to happen on the terms of, he actually says, a Marxist analysis. And he said he never used the word Marx because it didn't work in polite society. And he was a professor, but he says this is an important confession because he feels he's selling out. He's flying first class on airlines, and he has to confess to his Marxism publicly in The Guardian to keep him honest. And what he says is the central contradiction of Marx that is relevant here is not the debt, but the idle savings. And what this means is capital cannot reinvest itself. If you look at corporate profits globally, they are enormously high. And when we look at Greece, we say there's no money. How can they have the humanitarian plank of the Thessaloniki program? There's no money. They have to raise taxes, but that would cause a recession. They're caught in these pincers. He makes the point that the problem is idle capital. There's too much money not being invested. Now, in Marxist tradition, that is where Marxism comes closest to Keynesianism, to say the central contradiction of capitalism is a crisis of demand. And so in that sense, he is a Keynesian. And, Keynesian is its mission when Keynes was alive in the 30s was in many respects to save capitalism from fascism. But he talks about another contradiction, which I think is really important here, and that's the contradiction of labor, that labor is something that's very qualitative, through which we realize our humanity. It has a utility, it has a concreteness to it, but what capitalism does is it turns labor into an alienated, that's the Marxist word, but many traditions on right and left have taken up that term, it turns it into an alienated quantity. And what happens is that for Marx, he realized a central category of Marx was freedom. And freedom is an economic category for Marx. It is the freedom of labor to determine itself. And he said strategically when the left prioritized only justice and equality and left freedom out of its demands, it ceded the grounds of labor, unalienated labor, as a political struggle. And he says, look, the democracy deficit that Syriza is trying to answer, that the left parties across Europe are trying to answer, the democracy deficit is a duh. He said, of course there's a democracy deficit, because it comes from the very fact that capitalism's aim is to alienate and quantify and make labor an easily interchangeable, replaceable concept. So the fight against the democracy deficit is to formulate a Marxist notion of freedom, which would be connected to an idea of labor as a site of self-realization. So finally, let me just conclude by saying that what would that mean? What are some strategic aspects of it? I mean, I think other people can speak to that Thessaloniki program and the various demands. They do include a lot of things which might not seem so radical, and also the symbolic deployments that you mentioned aren't always radical. But a deep discussion point in the left, and this goes very deep into the Linkspartei with there are various caucuses with various associations in these parties. But the deep discussion of the left today is the difference between populist strategies which go back to the 20s, to the 1930s, and an earlier left strategy called the United Front. This is sort of technical 30s stuff, but United Front as opposed to Popular Front. And the United Front, the 20s strategy of the United Front, did say populism wasn't enough, that you also had to have class strategies. And the left is trying to think their way through that. On the one hand, there are no longer exclusive working class parties, whether in the Syriza coalition, or whether in Germany, or whether in Spain. So they can't simply pursue a united front strategy. So what they have to do is some sort of populist strategy. And they look at this through terms, famous Gramscian terms like hegemony, and that might be a too specialized term. So one formulation of it from both Syriza and the Linkspartei